want to continue today talking about some bits and pieces in a book I recently wrote titled Coastal South Carolina Fish and Game, History, Culture, and Conservation. One can't talk about history of coastal South Carolina without talking about the plantation culture. And what I really want to talk about very quickly today is the role of African Americans in these plantations, and in particular, how they were involved in fishing and hunting. Now, it's important to understand that at the height of the plantation culture, African Americans comprised about 60% of the population. It's also important to recognize that the plantation culture was largely fueled by the conversion of lowland swamps into vast areas that were used for the growing of rice. On these plantations, one could find commonly hundreds of slaves living, and of course one can envision a situation where if those slaves were making use of wild game, there would be a lot of pressure in the immediate vicinity of the plantations. What do we know about what these slaves ate? Well, there have been some archaeological studies that have looked at this. One study found the following. Diet of slaves was dominated by foods raised on the plantation and provided as rations. Chicken, corn, cows, geese, peas, potatoes, and rice. However, slaves supplemented their diet with wild game such as clams, crows, fish, foxes, hawks, possums, oysters, raccoons, squirrels, and turtles. And of course, what this means is slaves, in order to supplement their diet with wild game, must also have owned guns. And indeed, if we look at the history of coastal South Carolina and the laws that were passed, slaves were allowed to own guns as long as they were involved in the fairly utilitarian processes of plantation life. A little bit later, as we get closer to the Civil War, there was some concern about slaves owning guns, and they started to restrict the types of guns that slaves could own. But generally, the right of slaves to own guns and to hunt was preserved even to the Civil War. And so I think what we can say about the role of slaves as far as fish and game is concerned is that, number one, they fished and hunted regularly to supplement their diet. Number two, they hunted regularly to eliminate the pests that would consume the rice crop. Both of these activities continued throughout the period of time when plantations were in existence and the slave culture was in existence. However, after the Civil War, the entire situation changed.